Dracula versus Frankenstein.
Welcome to Book Battles.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Paperback Journeys, where today we're having a book battle between the legends of classic horror. Everything's just going to be my own personal opinion and what I preferred about each of the books as they face off with each other in a kind of like a tournament format. We're going to span from gothic Transylvanian castles to eerie estates in the English countryside. Let's get started with the contestants. First up is the first ever sci-fi. It's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Then The Strange Case of Dr. Jackal and Mr. Hyde. Next up is the surreal King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. Then The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. Dracula by Bram Stoker. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. The Fall of the House of Asha by Edgar Allan Poe. And finally, Are There Ghosts or Is She Just Mental? The Turn of the Screw. So let's put all of these books into the randomizer and find out who's going to be facing who. Alright, so in the first bracket we have The Haunting of Hill House versus Dracula. Then we've got The Fall of the House of Usher versus Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Next up, we've got The Turn of the Screw versus Frankenstein. And then finally, The King in Yellow versus The Call of Cthulhu. Okay, so let's start with The Haunting of Hill House versus Dracula. I think this is a really good contrast of classic horror. On one hand, you've got, in The Haunting of Hill House, a kind of intimate setting that's filled with psychological dread, and it focuses on the internal struggles of the characters in a house that is seemingly sentient. And then on the other hand, you've got Dracula, which is much broader in its scope. It actually spans across continents. So you've got, as I mentioned, Transylvanian castle and the village at the bottom of the castle. And then you've got the Victorian streets of London and a brand new cast of characters to meet and as they interact with one another. The Haunting of Hill House is, I think, commonly seen as the haunted house story, and it influenced so many writers that a lot of us know and love. It's a big influence for Stephen King, certainly, also Neil Gaiman. With both of these writers, they say that The Haunting of Hill House is one of the books that still shakes them to their core. But with that said, Dracula influenced, I think, the whole horror genre. The one problem that I had with The Haunting of Hill House is that I just didn't like any of the characters. They were all squabbling and just constantly bickering. I thought that they were all deeply unlikable, and it was difficult for me to root for any of them. On the other hand, with Dracula, I mean, Dracula's got Renfield. It's got Renfield. So, yeah. It's probably the best character in the book. I'm going to give it to Dracula. I'm going to give this to Dracula just based off of Renfield. Bracket number 2 is The Fall of the House of Usher versus The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This one's a lot harder for me because I just loved both of these books. And also for kind of the same reasons. I think both of these books are so good at capturing atmosphere. With The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you feel as though you're walking through the foggy streets of Victorian London and you've got the cobbles underneath your boots. It really kind of captured that crispness in the air. And then with The Fall of the House of Usher, it's like a more of a southern gothic, right? And it's just the marshlands, the desolate, decrepit House of Usher. It's almost impossible for me to separate these two, honestly. This is really difficult. I love the ambiguity of what is causing the maladies of the Ushers. But also, I really like the twist ending of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, even though it wasn't a twist to me as a modern reader. I can still kind of appreciate it for the time that it was written. I think because of the dialogue, which I really enjoyed in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I've got to give it to Robert Louis Stevenson, but just. I think that actually The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is one of the best books that I read last year. And that was surprising to me, by the way. I wasn't expecting it to be that good. I thought it was just kind of be a little bit fairy tale-esque, you know, something from like the Brothers Grimm. But I really enjoyed it, and it was purely because of the atmospheric writing. Next up is Frankenstein versus The Turn of the Screw. I really liked The Turn of the Screw. It was a nice short read. I got through it in an afternoon. It was just perfect to be reading in and around Halloween, when I read all of these books in October of last year. And again, I loved it for its ambiguity. You never really can tell in the book. I'm not going to spoil the ending or anything, but you never can really tell whether or not the house is haunted, or whether the narrator, the governess, is kind of losing her mind. And so that is chilling, but it's chilling for two different reasons, right? Because you can read it either way. I also found the little boy, or I think his name was Miles, I found him to be really unsettling. There was a kind of mystery behind why he was sent back to the house from school. Never really kind of find out about that. And also, he talks as if he is a man, an old man, trapped in a little boy's body. And the way he's always kind of smiling and asking the governess if she really cares about him. The creepy little kid, and nothing scarier than a creepy little kid, is it? And then you've got Frankenstein, and I tell you something, Frankenstein, it just blows my mind that this book was published by a teenage girl in 1818. It feels like it could have been released today. Yeah, and I know that's a bit of a cliche to say with some older books, but really, I think if you read it, you will feel as though, yeah, this could easily be a new release. I think the thing that took me by surprise the most is how much I sympathized with Frankenstein's monster, and how emotional I felt. There was a couple of scenes where I just felt so protective of the monster, and I didn't expect that. I like how this book has so many layers to it. And it allows me, it's deep enough where I can still, even today, months after first reading it, still think back and, you know, I think about this book all the time, honestly. I think because of the emotion that I felt with Frankenstein, and because of how much it surprised me, I've got to go with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That's the clear winner in this round for me. Okay, so the fourth bracket is The Call of Cthulhu versus The King in Yellow. This is a really interesting bracket, I think, because both of the books fall within a subgenre which is called cosmic horror, or weird horror, or some people like to call it Lovecraftian horror. Robert W. Chambers wrote The King in Yellow in 1895 and was apparently a huge inspiration for H.P. Lovecraft, although he wasn't always kind in the way he spoke about Chambers. H.P. Lovecraft said about Chambers that he was one of the fallen titans, equipped with the right brains and education, but out of the habit of using them. Like I say, just not a very nice person. I mean, this really was... Him saying this was the least of his moral crimes. If you look him up, and I don't suggest that you do, because, you know, it's just going to be depressing, especially if you like Lovecraft's books. It's probably best not to find out about him. He's a nasty piece of work. The King in Yellow is one of the weirdest books I've ever read. It's a collection of short stories set in Paris and New York. Usually the characters are kind of artistic and bohemian, and it's really centered around a play which, if you read it, you will go insane. The first half of the book was genuinely creepy. The first short story, called The Repairer of Reputations, was amazing. I loved it so much, and it set the bar so high for the rest of the short stories. Unfortunately, in my opinion, it was the best one, and it kind of went steadily downhill from there. There were a couple of really good cosmic horrors, but then it drifted into romance and a couple of war stories that felt detached from the earlier short stories, and I do wonder if that was kind of by design. And then you've got The Call of Cthulhu, which I was so excited to read because Cthulhu, I think, is one of Lovecraft's most famous creations, but it felt so removed. It's told in an epistolary fashion, so basically through letters and articles. Usually when books use this device, it's told from the perspective or we're kind of like, as the reader, reading letters from the character that witnessed these events. But with this book, that's not the case. It's actually told from the perspective of someone that's reading the letters from the perspective of someone else. So it's like twice removed. And because of that, it feels a little bit empty, feels a little bit, it deadens the feeling of horror. We're too far away from it, in my opinion. I'll definitely give Lovecraft more chances. This was the first Lovecraft story that I'd ever read. I know that he's this massive, beloved horror writer, and so I'd be crazy not to give him another chance. But this round goes to The King in Yellow. Okay, so this is where things get interesting. We've got Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde versus Dracula. Look, obviously, you can't deny that Dracula has had a bigger impact on horror than any other book, probably. And the opening scenes with Jonathan Harker exploring Transylvania, traveling first to Transylvania and then exploring the village and then the castle, and then not being allowed to leave, that was epic. But then after that, in my opinion, it dips a little bit and then kind of drags for a long time once the characters arrive in England. Whereas Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde starts tense, and then the intensity rises and rises as more information is revealed, until it builds to a very famous climax at the end. The only thing that I wish is that I didn't know the ending of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I think it would have been a 5-star read for me if I didn't know the ending, but it's such a famous story, such famous character, that there's no way that I could have gone about life avoiding the secret behind Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, yeah, but still, this round goes to The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Made it to the final. And then on the other side, we've got Frankenstein versus The King in Yellow. I think the same as Dracula, The King in Yellow starts really strong and then slowly starts to fade, and the intensity and the fear lessens as the story goes on. With Frankenstein, though, the story keeps evolving and becoming something else, and you think you know what it's about, and then you realize that there's more layers behind layers behind layers, and it's just incredible to me, once again, that this book was written over 200 years ago. It's mental. So here we have it. The two big dogs, in my opinion. It's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde versus Frankenstein. Okay. How am I gonna decide? These are easily two of the best books that I read in 2023. And I think the reason that I love both of these books is that they're so heavy with themes. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, we're kind of delving deep into the human psyche and the duality of man. We've got the civilized version of ourselves that we present to society, and then we've got the darker, more primal desires that maybe drive some of our actions, but we restrict. And in Frankenstein, we're asked millions of questions like, should we ever place boundaries on scientific discovery? Just because we can do something, should we? Just in order to progress? What are the responsibilities that we should take for the actions of our children? Why does society base us on the way that we look rather than the content of who we are? And it also has some of the most moving scenes that I read in 2023. But, all right. I'm ready to reveal the winner of the Book Battle Classic Horror Edition. Before I do, if you like this kind of video and you have any ideas for future book battles, then please comment below and let me know. If you want me to compare any authors or series or books or anything like that, let me know. And if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, that'd be really nice, wouldn't it? Okay, so the best classic horror book that I've ever read is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And now that I think about it, I think this is actually the best book that I read in 2023, period. It's just so moving and so beautiful. By the way, I actually made a video series in October of classic horror book reviews that I'm actually pretty proud of. And if you'd like to see the first video in that series, then you can click up here. Thanks so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it, and happy reading.